In the last video, we talked about AI regulations in general. Now, in this video, I want to make it more concrete. Let's take a concrete medical example. And now imagine you are working on an AI system that helps detect cancer from medical images. For example, analyzing scans to identify early signs of tumor. At the first step, this sounds a very powerful use case. The system can support doctors, speed up diagnostics, of course, and potentially save a lot of lives. But at the same time, this is exactly the kind of system where things can go seriously wrong, if you understand what I mean. And well, the first question you should ask as a product owner here, what kind of system is this? You need to identify the risk of this feature. You remember, there are 4 classes according to the AI/EU Act: unaccepted risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. In this case, the answer for this feature is clear. This is a high-risk AI feature. You begin to include what the system should not only do, but how it should behave in critical edge cases situations. And this is the most creative part. You start asking, how certain should the system be? What should happen if it is unsure? Who reviews the results, and which answer you expect to minimize the risk? For unaccepted risk, as you understand, you should not implement such kind of features. But let us move forward here. Because the system directly affects health decisions, and these decisions can have life-changing consequences, we need to deep dive into this feature regarding the AI/EU Act. And this realization usually happens very early, ideally early when you define to implement this feature. That's why it's important to think about AI governance before you start to implement the feature and to deliver it to the customers. Because the moment you understand that you are dealing with a high-risk system, you don't write a normal user story anymore. So, if you simply write, the system should detect cancer in medical images, you are missing the most important part. Instead of it, you should start to shape this story differently. Now we go one step deeper. That means, what exactly is the AI doing? Let's say the system analyzes images and gives a prediction. High probability of cancer or low probability of cancer. But behind that simple output, there are several critical risks. The first one is accuracy. What happens if the system is wrong? There are 2 possibilities. False negative, the system says everything is fine, but in the real world, actually, they are cancer. Or a false positive, the system says they are cancer, but there's not. And that can create stress, unnecessary tests, and even harmful procedures. So, as a product owner, you start to make this visible. These questions don't stay only questions. They become part of your requirements and, of course, of your backlog, because that must be clarified. So already at this early stage, your documentation changes. Not as a formal document somewhere else, but directly where you define the product. For example, R42. In your user stories or acceptance criteria, anyhow, you should put all these answers. And from there, anything becomes more concrete, of course. And just not in your thinking, but also in your everyday work. For example, during the refinement, you don't only discuss how to build the prediction, you also need to discuss when the system is uncertain. How should confidence be displayed in that case, and when should a human be required to review the results? And these discussions turn into the real work, as you can imagine as a product owner, into the task and into the features and clarifications. Here you must define a way to show confidence level, a work of human review as well, the whole process, and a mechanism to monitor errors. So risk becomes part of the product itself. The next important aspect is the data. The model is trained on medical images, but not all the data are the same. You need to ask, where does this data come from? Does it represent different age groups, different entities, or different equipment or hospitals at least? And again, this doesn't stay theoretical. At some point, you need to make this explicit. For example, you document what data sources are used, what limitations are known, and where the models might not perform well. This doesn't need to be complex, but it can live close to your product. In your backlog again, or in a simple product note, linked directly to the feature. The most important part here is it is visible for everyone, for the developers, and as well to the stakeholders. When it is not visible, it will not be considered in the decisions. Now, let's move to another important point, and this human oversight. In a medical context, AI should never replace doctors. So, the system should support decisions, but not make them alone. And this is where you or your role becomes very concrete again. You don't just say there should be human oversight, you design it, you define, and which step a doctor reviews the result, what they see, how they can override the system. And they are not ideas, they are features which are represented in your backlog. And now let's talk about the transparency. If a doctor receives a prediction from the system, they need in somehow level to understand what exact and why. Not the full use case, but why is this area flagged by the feature, by the system, and what influenced the result. And again, this becomes something you actively design with your product. You define how explanations are shown to the doctor, what information is visible and available, and how simple it needs to be actually useful. Otherwise, the system became a black box for the doctor, and the black boxes are difficult to trust, especially in the healthcare. And now, exact here is another layer: data protection. Medical data are extremely sensitive, so you need to be very clear in your feature, your requirements. How is this data used? Who can access? And this is something that typically happens before development starts, when you align with legal and data teams. Because if this is unclear, you don't have a solid foundation to build on. And even more importantly here, you make sure this is documented. Not as a legal document you never see, but in a way that is connected to your product, so that everyone involved understands the boundaries. And this brings us to another important risk: overreliance on AI. If doctors trust the system too much, they might stop questioning it. So your product should not only give answers, it should encourage critical thinking as well. For example, showing uncertainty levels or highlighting when the system is less confident. And again, this becomes very practical. You don't just talk about it, you implement, introduce it into your feature. So when you look in this whole system, you start to see something important. This is not just one feature. It is a complex system with many risks: accuracy risks, data risks, bias risks, misuse risks, and trust-related risks. And your role as a product owner is to make these risks visible to the users and translate them into the product. And this doesn't happen once. This starts when you decide to implement your AI feature. It continues during the whole refinement. It becomes concrete during the development. And it comes back again after the release, as you can imagine. Because once the system is live, you start observing. Where does it fail? What patterns appear? And these observations became new work like a maintenance tasks. So over time, you are not just building a feature, you accompany the feature and managing a whole system. And throughout this entire process, one question stays the same. How do we reduce harm? Because in healthcare, this is the central question, of course. So if you take one idea from this example, let it be like AI in sensitive domains is not just about performance, it's about responsibility. And this responsibility is something you actively design into your product from the beginning. And in the next video, we can go deeper into these specific topics and see how we can detect and reduce bias in the AI system. See you there.